So I'm going to touch on bias awareness. I know we hear about it all the time, but I specifically want to share some things that the hiring manager can do in the process of trying to really reduce bias in your hiring process. One of the things is to make sure that you understand the challenge in your hiring process when there is bias, and there's always bias. So one of the things that you can do as a hiring manager is to seek out professional help, one, to assess and evaluate what your bias are, and to train your teams to mitigate for that bias and to be aware of it, so that when you're in the interview process and when you're assessing talent, you're aware of that bias and you work through it to get past it. As the hiring manager, you are in a very unique position to be able to do that. And I mentioned this before, hiring for values and not necessarily for culture fit is a way to make sure that you are leveling the playing field and being fair. So the other thing, and probably one of the most actionable items that we can talk about here today, is just that interviewer capability. Making sure as a hiring manager and a leader in your company, you've got the right people on your interviews and they're prepared to do the interviews. So I have a note here to take experienced interviewers and get those people into your interview. Sometimes that becomes a problem because the experienced interviewer may not be a great interviewer. So if you are looking to make sure that you've got a team of people who can assess the talent, make sure that there's training for those interviewers. Make sure that you're aware of the question that this interviewer has been asking for the last 5 or 6 or 7 or even 20 years that may not be appropriate in today's market. If you're interviewing candidates the same way as you interviewed them 15 or 20 years ago, just so you can maintain that culture fit, you may want to take a look at that practice. So some of the interviewer tips that I'd like to include, one, is to make sure that you've got a model where you're able to assess the candidate and understand, did they give you all the answers to the questions you were looking for? For example, if you interview a candidate who's from a diverse background and your interview team is all homogeneous and all the same and came from the same backgrounds, when you ask that candidate a question, it may not come back in the cadence, the language, the tonality that you're looking for, and you're going to no hire the candidate. I've seen this happen in multiple companies over multiple years, and it's not necessarily because the interviewer didn't want to hire someone. It was because they didn't have a way of evaluating. So all the companies have tools. You'll hear EAR, you'll hear Spark. I have one that I call Sparkle. And the S in Sparkle stands for what's the story? And this is typically designed for a behavioral interview. So if you say, hey, tell me about a time when you had to solve a difficult customer issue, using Sparkle allows you to get that candidate, you're listening for them to talk about the story that they had. The P is for what problem were they trying to solve. The A is what action did they take to solve the problem. The R is for what are the results that they achieved from those actions. The K is what do they know now that they didn't know then, and how would they make adjustments to their effort? And then the L is for what are the lessons learned, and how would they apply those lessons in a future effort or a future problem. And then the E in Sparkle is what evidence do they have today that says their actions were successful and had the impact they wanted, and everything that they just said is true in that example. And so use something like Sparkle. Sparkle's probably a little bit long, a little bit more complicated, but it lets you dig in a little bit. And the way you use this in application, if a candidate answers a question, but they don't fully answer the question, the tendency of the interviewer is to just kind of write them off and move to the next question. My suggestion is that you probe that candidate. If they didn't give you enough detail in what their actions were, just ask them, hey, tell me a little bit more about that. Let me understand a little bit more about what you're sharing. What did you learn from this situation? What do you know now that you wish you would have known before? What evidence do you have that everything you just talked about works now or is true? And so that's one way that you can continue to probe that candidate on the interviewer or interview questions. The other thing as a manager that you can do is make sure you are showcasing and have diverse interviewers. If you've got diversity in your company, and when I say diversity, I'm saying broadly, certainly ethnicity, certainly gender, but there's lots of, if you don't have the ethnicity or the gender in your company, go find people who just think differently and get them on the interview loop. Sometimes we only want people who are subject matter experts, but one of the things that will help is just having that diversity of thought on your interview is going to put you in a position to better evaluate, is that candidate someone we want to bring to the table because they have the values that we want, they have the skills that we want, they have the background that we want. The other thing you want to do is really look at the role requirements. A lot of times as a manager, you're trying to hire the best person with all the skills available for that job. And we cram the job descriptions with lots of nice to haves, but not necessarily the right requirements for do the job. So the basic qualifications to do the job. We just want to get that person because we're trying to make the most out of every hire and get the best person that we possibly can, but it might not, some of the skills that we're looking for may not be part of the needs for that particular role.